into it. How are y'all feeling?
I'm
I
at
can go
your
either way. Go ahead, sorry.
yeah. No, I'm at your disposal. I'm enjoying the chatting very much, but happy to jump in. It's your recording. You make of it what you will.
Well, I think Justin and I were just talking before we got on the call about the idea that actually kind of what we want for this, I think, is a more free-flowing, curious exploration of perspectives and questions and ideas.
Yeah.
Um, this is not intended to be any sort of debate or attempt to
Yep.
prove anything.
Mhm.
Uh, from my perspective, as an outside observer of the interactions between the two of you and your exchange of essays and so forth, um, it feels like to some degree you're writing, and this is not to assume that that your writing is a full disclosure of everything that you think and feel and how you see the world, but the perspectives that you are expressing um, are visions for a world, are a kind of a taste of what it's like to embody a view of the world. And they are both very different. There's a lot of convergence too, but they're both very unique perspectives on the world that I think embodied lend themselves to certain ways of inaction, of
Mhm.
interacting with the world around you. Where again, I think there's a lot of convergence, but the points of divergence are especially interesting. Um, and so, what I'd want to invite both of you to do is to just be that, like live into that and your curiosity, and to feel welcome and invited to pause and ask each other questions about things, like, oh, well, when I look at that, I see it a little differently. How,
Yeah.
what does it look like for you? Because I think a lot of people who might be watching this will have some theological sophistication and will want to nitpick at ideas and so forth, and they can do that. They're going to do it anyway. It's good work. Someone has to do it. But I think most people are seeking something. They're seeking a kind of a quote unquote right relationship with God and self and world. And that's an embodied act, not really a mental one. And
Hmm.
I think, at least for me, what I feel like I taste in your respective writings are different ways of living in right relationship with God and self and world. And so I'm hoping that we can see a little of that kind of in action just by you guys being you. So I hope there's no stress in any of this. We just kind of want to have a good chat on a Saturday morning.
Yeah, that's great. It's so rare that there is this kind of space, where we're able to be different and able to actually enjoy the fact that we're different and we're journeying together, and you know, we don't have to defend or be right um, point by point. So that's wonderful. That's a much more human way of being, and it's almost like living together, even though we're so far apart on the little planet that we occupy. But I really appreciate it. Thanks for the creating the space and the invitation.
Yeah, I think that open dialogue kind of thing is super important. For one, I don't have a good enough grasp on this topic to like debate it properly and be like, I have the answer and I'm going to prove it, because my opinions fluctuate on this stuff constantly. And
I'm in the same boat, honestly.
yeah,
Yeah,
yeah, and it's like,
just a layperson reading books that are over my pay grade.
yeah. And I mean, I don't have any formal background in philosophy. So I just picked up Eriugena one day and decided I wanted to know what he was about. And I read through Paraphysian and had no idea what it was. And I just sort of like trudged through it until eventually it started to click a little bit.
Hmm.
Um, but I know that process, is not going to give me the full breadth of everything. And there's all kinds of people who have perspectives where I'm like, well, I didn't even think of how Eriugena was saying that. Or, he packs so much in one sentence that you could spend the whole year just unpacking one page. And Paraphysian
Yeah,
is like 1,000 pages. So I don't have 1,000 years, but
yeah. I really admire that way of reading. And I think we live in a world where we're pressed to think that we've got to, you know, accomplish X amount and everything's measured and, you know, how many books, and to slow down with something that you've just encountered, you know, where you're like, this is a place to stay for a while, you know, this is a place to live, and treat an author that way is just fantastic. So I really admire that, and the insights that I've seen you bring out of that in over a period of time. You know what I mean? Like you drop these nuggets in, and you can see that you're journeying and you're unpacking things, and that just, you don't see that in too many dialogues where you kind of get a glimpse of someone really sitting with something and allowing it to percolate and sink in, and allowing themselves to sink into that world and starting to unpack it. So yeah, the fruits of that are apparent, and I really admire it.
Well, thank you. It's very kind of you to say. Just as a note for everybody who's watching, Jesse and I entered into an exchange of essays a little while ago talking about the, I usually say atemporal fall. Jesse likes to say meta-historical fall, and we can unpack why that is. Which is this incredibly beautiful, fascinating, and complicated idea that looks at the fall from Eden as not a historical event. You know, like if we traced our lineage back, we all sort of descended from Adam and Eve as if they were the first sort of biological people, which, you know, doesn't match evolution and all that kind of stuff. But still takes it seriously and doesn't just sort of discard it as ancient nonsense or something like that, and looks for the wisdom in it. And one of the ways that happens is by saying that, you know, the Eden is a spiritual reality, I think is a fair way to say it. Something that's, and this is another topic we can debate, outside of time or in a different form of time. And Jesse and I have gone back and forth on that. And that's another topic I'm not sure I understand, but that I love to think about. And that sort of sets the tone for all of creation and all of history from the Big Bang up until now and into the future. And I'd love to talk also about what the future has in store, because I think that's a big question. You know, is there a coming restoration of all things where the physical universe itself is going to change, which is a big part of the atemporal fall theology, but one that I struggle with from a modern perspective and a modern cosmology. So that's definitely one of the areas where reading Rachal, I have a great sympathy for him because he lived 1,000 years ago and had no idea about, you know, the modern cosmology that we do. So it's certainly not his fault if he was wrong, but I think maybe there's some adjusting, some thinking to be done there. So anyway, we entered into this exchange of essays. The info section, the show notes on the YouTube video will have links for all of those essays, and we'll put them in order so you can read the sort of sequence. People can read the sequence of things. You can pause the video now and do that ahead of time if you're really nerdy like me, or you can just watch it and go back to them later if you want. Yeah, and so we're basically just going to jump off. I had mentioned to Jesse maybe two areas of topic. One was one that he had mentioned to me. Oh, go ahead, Owen. Yeah.
Well, I just wanted to pause actually before, and I hate that because you've got some killer momentum going. But do you guys want to say a little bit about who you are real fast?
Sure. Yeah. So I'm Justin Coutts. I live in Canada on Manitoulin Island. I have a sort of a different background. I grew up Quaker, which in practice meant I got a lot of silence and not much theology or no theology, basically. And so it had some great benefits, but it's also something that I like the theology and ritual and stuff. So I sort of and being formed in that tradition by elders and going through the traditional sort of practices and all that. I found my way into the church around 10 years ago, I guess now, and I was in seminary for a little while. I had a church where I was a pastor, a Protestant, mainline Protestant church in Canada, the United Church, which is basically the Methodists and the Presbyterians came together and became one church back in the 20s or something. And I loved preaching and I loved pastoral care, but I found seminary to be a little boring, if I can be honest, and they didn't have anything about the atemporal fall at all, which would have kept me around perhaps. But I eventually decided that while I love ministry, I didn't love seminary, and so I decided to just go independent and do my own thing. I started New Eden Ministry maybe 5 years ago, I want to say now, sort of right before COVID started. And that timing was perfect because COVID started and we had it all set up. And so people were like, how do we do church online? And I was like, we've got it all up and running now. So just come walk in the door. And the community grew from there and has been able to remain after COVID, which has been wonderful. So we meet regularly several times a week on Zoom and stuff like that. And I do spiritual direction as my main sort of job, so to speak, although I like to think of it as a ministry or a vocation. Yeah, so that's me.
Great. You have a book as well, and are working on a second one, right?
Yeah, I have a book out and I'm working on like 10.
The Psalter of the Birds is the one that is available.
Yeah, it's up for sale on Amazon. You can find it on the website as well. So you
Yeah,
can just
it's an
Google my name.
amazing
Yeah, you got
collection.
a copy, eh? Have you had a chance to read the intro or anything like that? Did you get
Yes,
a
what
chance
I
to...
wish I could do is do some of the actual, chanting or singing metrically, but I've got to learn because you've actually got some of that, you made it available in the book, which is just amazing. But I haven't learned the way to read it. But it's an incredible collection of poetry and covering, really remarkable span of time and spiritual leaders. So yeah, it's beautiful. Highly commend it.
Well, I'm glad you think so. Yeah. If I'm being fully honest, I don't know how to do the music part either. That was another member of our community who did that part. And
So
so
that's cool.
I love to sing and do stuff like that. So I have a musical tendency, but I have no idea how to read music. And that's just one of those, some things I'm really good at and some things my brain just farts. And that's just sort of the way I am. So I do the free chant style, which I put in there, which is, I mean, I think anybody could do it if you try.
Yeah, that is within reach for me.
Yeah.
That's cool. Yeah, I grew up a Presbyterian missionary kid in Taiwan, speaking two dialects of Chinese. So also, like you, kind of a different background from the typical sort of American evangelical experience. Although my parents were evangelical missionaries, American evangelical missionaries. So my dad is a active minister in his denomination to this day. And I'm the oldest of 9 kids, so and I'm the only one who has not kind of remained American evangelical for the most part. So I know that world well. And I learned a lot, and I'm really learning to be more and more grateful for it in some ways, although I've really gone far afield in other ways. But a few years ago, my wife and 3 kids and I joined the Orthodox Church, and we've been worshiping. We've been worshiping there longer than we've been, chrismated, but we were chrismated maybe just 5 years ago or so. So yeah, a kind of typical American journey as well. It's sort of a bit of a fad, honestly, probably in recent years. With Orthodoxy, and some of it's pretty ugly, and some of it's pretty wonderful. And it's like everything else. If we believe in a fallen world, maybe it shouldn't surprise us. But anyway, that's me in a nutshell. I'm a teacher and educator. I have a master's degree from the University of St. Andrews in Scotland in history, and an MLit there, and then ended up making a living for the most part teaching K-12, teaching high school, and then a school principal, and work for a little curriculum publishing company now.
And you, in your experience in Taiwan, you had some experience with the Taiwanese indigenous. I'm not sure the proper terminology, but and that's partially influenced your writing on fairies and nature spirits, hasn't it? I think that
I think it's
wrote the guest post on "Can Christianity Be Saved by Fairies," which I'll put in the notes. Really well received. I loved it, and so did everybody else. So yeah.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, that childhood experience definitely influenced me in a variety of ways. I mean, I take pretty seriously. It's hard to articulate, it's hard to talk about, but I take pretty seriously the reality of gods and goddesses and fairies and nature spirits, and I don't think that they're, just childhood fantasies or, cute or, story elements or something like that. They're really a part of our world. Um, and that was definitely impacted by my own upbringing. So where I grew up there in Kaohsiung, Taiwan at the time, it was pretty third world and pretty traditional Chinese. So, we would chase water buffaloes down the street. And there were, the rice fields were plowed multiple times a year. We all lived outside of our little homes in these row houses right alongside of an agricultural area. And the local farmers would actually put these big buckets, these big, barrels out at the end of every street, and all the families on that street would dump all their leftovers into the bucket, and they'd pick them up once a day and feed the pigs. And, we all bought our food in an open air market. All the produce was hauled in that morning, sold, 4 a.m. the farmers would be setting it up, and the, predominantly housewives would come by in the morning, and very, very few people even had refrigeration. You would buy that food that day that was grown, just, less than a mile away and eat it. And so, yeah, in that context, there were all these, folk religious traditions that, most people have lived with for, thousands of years. And shamanism of a particular, Chinese Asian type. It's very much an overlap. We weren't that far from the Philippines, and then Taiwan was occupied by the Japanese for like 80 years, and that's, the northern island. So there's a lot of overlap between some of the religious folk traditions, particularly, between Japan and the Philippines and Taiwan. Like the goddess Matsu was a very popular goddess, and she would, keep people safe at sea. And it's an island with a fishing industry and all of that. So that meant a lot to people. And she's very popular in Japan, as well as Taiwan. And she actually didn't have shaman serving her, which is very unique. All the other gods and goddesses did. But when she had her birthdays, all the other gods and goddesses, the shaman would come, serving the gods and goddesses as they arrived at the big festival, on her birthday. So, yeah, I just was part of a lot, and ancestor worship, is a very basic part of life. Everybody, daily, almost daily rituals. So my mom would say, all of us children were like a little herd of goats. We just wandered from house to house, in this row house neighborhood. And I would eat multiple meals a day. Like sometimes I get 2 or 3 lunches, like a hobbit or something. And different moms, you just wander from house to house, and the moms would feed you, and you go play outside and you'd wander in. And the mothers just sort of raised us communally. We called everybody auntie. And but as a part of life like that, I just, when people were offering incense sticks to their ancestors, that everyone's in a line, I would grab my incense sticks, and I was 3 years old. You just do what all your buddies are doing. So I participated as a missionary kid in pagan worship, from speaking in kind of traditional Christian terms. And it's definitely shaped me. I joke sometimes that I became Orthodox because of attending Muslim prayer services. And I was really struck watching Muslim prayer services, how the little kids just transition kind of naturally from like 1 and 2 and 3 years old to 6 and 7, where they would just start prostrating and, joining the men in all the rituals naturally. And I asked one of the guys after a prayer service, how do you teach the kids to do that? And they just laughed at me. They were like, what are you talking about? Like a 3-year-old, all the men are prostrated, and the 3-year-olds are just climbing up and down their backs, like, like they're a, human jungle gym. And, jumping off their necks, and all, just, and then the 6 and 7-year-olds were all prostrated, all, doing exactly what the men were doing. And they laughed at me. They're like, a 3-year-old's going to climb on your back, and a 7-year-old's going to try to be one of the big boys. Like, it's just, and I had grown up, sitting in Presbyterian pews and listening to preaching and singing the hymns. And, you know, my mom would give us these little mitts to like keep us quiet. And, you know, you would get scolded if you were swinging your legs. And it would just felt so, I was sort of embarrassed that I had asked the question, how do you teach the kids to do that? They were so amused that I had asked it. And I sort of realized this is like what I did with, you know, the neighborhood I grew up in with ancestor worship and shamanism. And, you know, it wasn't all good. I'm not saying that, but neither is everything in Orthodox Christianity, all good. But anyway, I'm really rambling, but you had asked about, if I'm influenced there, and I would definitely think so. Yeah.
Maybe before you introduce yourself, Owen, I might jump in with a story if I can that I think might segue a little bit, that idea. So this is just a personal thing. I grew up, or I didn't, not when I grew up, so I'm just catching my words here. When I was in ceremony, a lot, one of the things that we would do is fast out in the bush. So we go out for 4 days and 4 nights. If you're real traditional, there's no tent or anything like that. And I've done that several times, and no food or water. And then when I started to do more Christian things, that practice was so formational for me and so important that I kept it up, and I still do. And I help other people do that sometimes as well. But one time I went out by myself. So when before I started helping others and after I had started to try and do things on my own, I had a few years of just going out by myself into the bush to do it without a camp, without people around me to support me. And I had been reading Paraphysian, and I wanted to have a better sense of Eriugena. So what I did is I went out in the bush. I did 3 days this time, and I just brought a hammock and a tarp and Paraphysian, and that was all I had. And I went out into this real scrubby bush out on the west end of the island. So up here, we're getting fairly far north, and sometimes the bush gets sort of like, it was just all poplars and balsams and sort of small, weak, scrubby bush, sort of desert-like in its own way. And I set up my hammock between 2 poplar trees, and I prayed to Eriugena, and I said, Eriugena, if you would be with me during this time, I want to understand your book, and I've been struggling, and I don't understand it really very well. And I dedicated those 3 days to just being with Eriugena. And the first day, this massive storm came out of nowhere, and it was this thunderstorm that just like trashed the whole thing. And my hammock was like, because poplar trees are super weak and flexible and stuff, right? So my hammock was just flying all over the place. And instead of being like sort of upset by it, I just felt so at peace. And my hammock flailing around in the storm felt like a baby, and it's rocking in its little like crib, sort of swinging back and forth. And I slept for an entire day in the storm. And then the next 2 days, Paraphysian just like clicked in my head in a way that, like, I don't know, some kind of participation in the angelic realms or something like that, if you want to use Eriugena's way of looking at things.
Yeah.
And it all just made so much more sense to me all of a sudden. And that's when I felt like I really started to, not that I get it all, but it really started to kind of like come together.
Mm-hmm.
So anyway, when you were talking about all that, it just kind of made me think of that and how it might segue a little. I interrupted Owen before you got a chance to introduce yourself.
I'm just this guy. That was way more interesting. Well, and it reminds me, and I don't want to creep, out of this conversation into another one, but I'm reminded, Justin, of that transmission thing that felt like it was coming up when we were talking with Carmen. Jesse, we had a chat with Carmen Acevedo Butcher just yesterday, and it was, it was amazing. But one of the things that kept popping out to me about and the different ways in which people were sharing was this and I hesitate to use Greek words that I don't really understand, but one of the things that kept coming up was this idea of wisdom transmitted through the vehicle of people speaking, or of shared space, or of a particular kind of receptive engagement with a text, where one is not trying to learn in a sort of epistemic propositional fashion. One is trying to engage, I think, wholeheartedly with what is here. whatever that may be. Um, and the way in which that opens us up to, I mean, to truths that are not in the words of the text, but have come through the text, for example, or words that are not said in conversation, but come through the space of the conversation. And I'm thinking again of this idea of, I mean, all these young children learning how to be Muslim through the transmission of their parents, the way in which it seeps into them non-verbally. And sure, there are all sorts of things that, you know, propositional boxes for Muslims to check, I'm sure. But like to embody Islam, to just live this way and to continue to let it evolve through you and through, I mean, through one generation after the next, and the same with you know, the other religions that you've encountered, these folk religions, and Justin talking about his own religion, and you know, he's saying like he holds on to a practice that was given to him from a different tradition, but he holds on to it because it's part of him now. You know, and just the real power, I think, in what gets transmitted non-verbally, the way that the spirit moves through us and the world, that doesn't really fit into conceptual boxes. And the more we try to put it into boxes, I mean, I even use the word the spirit moves through, but like that lights up boxes for people. What spirit? What is he talking about? You know, but what I'm talking about is not a thing that fits in boxes. It's a texture. It's an experience of the world. It's an orientation to self and other and the phenomenal realm, and that which seems to be under it and through it and around it and holding it. And you know, I think, again, kind of going back to what I said at the beginning about the perspectives your writings embody, it's that same sort of thing that most interests me more than like how do we negotiate the conceptual differences. It's these seem to be places for wisdom to come in, whatever that means to any of us listening. I'm really touched by that. I myself, for whatever it's worth, I'm a spiritual director in Abbeville, Louisiana, down at the end of North America, where the water is increasingly encroaching. And I do, a lot of my work is interspiritual. My own background is interspiritual. I'm a Presbyterian. I'm a PCUSA. And but I grew up in a culturally Catholic area, you know, where like Presbyterian ministers do Ash Wednesday ceremonies and the Presbyterians give up things for Lent. And it's, you know, it's part of who we are as Cajuns, this whole Catholic way of relating to life. And as a very young person, I told my mom I didn't want to go to church because I wanted to be like Jesus, but I didn't want to be like Christians.
How old were you when you were articulating that?
What's that?
How old were you when you were articulating that to your mom?
I said it out loud for the first time at 14. But it was a growing thing. I'm a weird kid. I read C.S. Lewis's Mere Christianity in 3rd grade.
That is weird.
Yeah, and read the Bible in middle school for accelerated reader points, and read Plato's Republic in 8th grade, and I, you know, I co-founded, I had help, the philosophy club at my high school because there wasn't one, and I remember trying to decide on college majors, and my parents wanted me to pick something practical, as they should have, you know, that's their job. But my counter argument was like, if I can't figure out what all of this means, then that doesn't matter. Like, I don't want to live in a world that for me feels like, in the absence of answers or a healthy orientation, I lived with the gnawing existential dread about the pointlessness of it all and the awfulness of the world. And, I was a pretty broken kid, and philosophical pursuits were what I thought would save me from that, really. And I loved the Jesus of the Gospels, still love the Jesus of the Gospels. And yet I was Presbyterian in a culturally Catholic area, and there was no way to access a deep spiritual tradition, which is, I think, what I needed at the time.
Yep.
And so I did what most people did. I went eastward. I had an experience in philosophy in my philosophy department where my mentor told me that philosophy is the art of defending your own prejudices. And I left school. I mean, I finished the semester and I took a year off and I tried to become a computer science major, and eventually came back to the philosophy department because it was easier to graduate that way. But there was a real sense that, like, philosophy, particularly analytic philosophy, as it was being handed to me, was not what I wanted. I wanted transformation. I wanted a deep and meaningful engagement with other people in the world.
Yeah.
I did not want to argue about the meaning of words and, um, or arguing about the meaning of words, which is like, that it's turtles all the way down as near as I can tell. And what I wanted was salvation from my own suffering and from the sense that life is kind of a desperate experience of, being a vulnerable meat sack in a hostile world. And went eastward and have had a Theravada Buddhist practice for some 20 odd years now. And made my way into the Vedanta as a spiritual pursuit, as in the David Bentley Hart group, there's this kind of constant attempt to engage with the Vedanta as a philosophical system. And there is that. But, I was taught coming into it, this is not philosophy, this is transformation, this is alchemy. And we're not here to prove certain truth claims. The sacred texts are mirrors for you to see yourself. And our job here is to help you see your true self, and that's what we're about. And I was really fed by that. And then not too long ago, it was 2020 actually, I was given some authorization to teach in an Advaita Vedanta spiritual circle, and did some of that, which was an interesting merging of practicing Presbyterian with the Theravada Buddhist practice, and now, this kind of weird vehicle for the Vedanta. And the larger context around all that is that I'm also an addict in recovery, and have been really fed by the 12-step tradition in an off and on again sort of way. I've wandered away because it seemed inadequate, and then I've discovered that actually it's exactly what I need, and found my way back there. And so, these things all mingle inside of me, I think, in much the same way that y'all are talking about your kind of indigenous experiences and so forth. I've been shaped into something that is at least heterodox. But
you still say I'm a Presbyterian.
Yeah, you can't get it out of you, I think. But I had a profoundly powerful experience in a puja ceremony where God quite clearly told me that this was a place I had been fed, but it was not mine, and that I needed to return to what was mine. And so I made my way back to a more intentional Christian spirituality, but I had to find it because it wasn't given to me by the church.
How long ago was that?
What's that?
How long ago was that?
That was in 2021.
Okay.
Yeah. And I So this has been a really interesting exploration for me. The realization, the abstract knowledge that there has been a contemplative and mystical stream in the Christian church all this time, but that the religious institution had completely failed to impart it to me. And I met in my 20s, I met a Buddhist monk, a wonderful man by the name of Yeshe. And he and I used to do walking meditation together and have long, interesting conversations. And he said, he was telling me how he became a monk, and he was actually a Quaker. And he said, I was really deeply fed by a Quaker, and by Quakerism, and I still consider myself a friend. He said, but I wanted to be more Christ-like, and the church couldn't tell me how to do that. It gave me a list of things to do. Like, I knew that I was supposed to be forgiving and charitable and yada, yada. He's like, but I didn't know how to become a person who knew how to do that. I didn't know how to live that out. And the church did not seem able to help me do it. And I like wandered through a bunch of cults basically. And I one day bumped into a Buddhist monk, and I was like, that is the most Christ-like person I've ever encountered. And so I'm going to go do what he does, and here I am. But that's his story, but it's also my story. I think I've continued to wander through traditions in the effort to grow in Christ likeness. And so that's kind of the work that I do with people. I try to meet them where they're at. I've done clinical studies in psychology, so that also informs my work, or graduate studies in clinical psychology. So that also informs my perspective a bit. But I come at all of this much less theologically in an academic or scholarly sense, and much more from like a lived experience. Like, where is God in this? Where do you feel truth? Where do you feel beauty? Where do you feel goodness in this? And how do we cultivate that so that you can be the person that you feel called to be? That was a lot of words. I'm really just this guy. I shouldn't have said so many.
We're all just this guy. That's the way it works. I think that's a great segue because for me, theology and philosophy are always in the service of contemplation. That's just like, it doesn't have to be that way for everybody, but for me, that's the way it is. I am influenced in my theology by my experience in contemplation, and I know that's taboo to say, like, this is my subjective inner experience, and therefore it's part of my theology. But I do it anyway. And I also do theology with the primary goal of having a framework in which to do spiritual practice. And I think that this topic has a lot to say to that, because whether or not you think the universe has fallen and how you think that happens and how we relate to the angelic world, to the gods and goddesses, to the angels and demons, whatever language you want to use, is shaped by all this kind of stuff. And so I think that's, for me at least, that's a good segue. I think that's, and I'm not great with the Greek either. I'm not good at all with Greek. I know none of it. But for what I understand, the original idea of a theologian was something more like that. That it was someone who encountered God and therefore could speak of God. Someone who, the separation of practice and theory is a modern one, from what I understand.
Yeah, absolutely. A theologian, there were many, desert fathers and such who would say a theologian is one who prays. Like that was sort of, someone who is contemplative. That's that's the foundation and really the end, the beginning and the end of theology. It's contemplation. Yeah.
Yeah, well, maybe with that we can segue into the topic. Where we left off in our essay exchange, Jesse had suggested we talk about two kinds of death: a kenotic death. If I'm understanding your position right, correct me if I'm not. That is the nature of the Trinity. It's the way each person of the Trinity empties himself into the other. And also the nature of how God creates the universe, creating a space of not God and emptying God's self for the sake of creation. And then distinguishing that from futurely death, from mortality, from cancer and all that stuff that we experience as mortal people. Is that a fair sort of beginning of where you had left off there? Is that a place you want to jump off from? Or? I just thought of it because that's where our conversation ended before I got busy with my baby and dropped the ball.
Well, I'm tempted actually to maybe ask if, since we've already used the fallen world language, if you guys can sort of succinctly express, at least for kind of yourselves, what what exactly are we talking about here when we talk about a fall? And I know that that's a huge sort of question to unpack, but like to the degree that you can point to it in lived experience and connect that to some sort of conceptual framework, like what do we mean when we talk about a fall from what into what, uh, and what really are the stakes of this conversation? Like why ultimately does it matter so much? Um, before we start talking about all the different ways of dying.
Yeah, that's a good idea. Yeah. Would you want to kick it off, Jesse?
Sure. I mean, I do think it's related to death because, the fall, as I'm articulating it, is it's a pretty crazy claim that our experience of empirical history and the entire cosmos, things like entropy, um, the fact that everything's, law, cosmic, cosmology as a science, physicists studying the universe and astronomers, have a variety of theories and debate these things, and they keep developing. But there's a wide consensus, that everything's slowly drifting apart. Second law of thermodynamics. It's a fairly bleak picture, at a certain level. And all of us are, continually subject to diseases that ultimately that'll ultimately kill us. So there's just something kind of fundamentally awry, and it's often characterized by it's often, if you try to give it a sort of one-word name, death is often picked in theological language. Yet at the same time, death is the means by which we're saved from death. The Easter or Paschal hymn of trampling down death by death is the way Christ brings life, is through death. And that kenotic love of self-emptying, it is a sacrificial love that gives of itself even to the point of death, so that death is in some sense a part of God's life, and is not evil, but there's some aspect of death that's some type of a limit placed on us, some type of a some type of a limit that's above and beyond our creaturely finitude. So I believe we're becoming gods, where all of creation is becoming divinized, becoming a part of God's life, the Pauline language of all in all, that Christ accomplishes. But within that, we have I think creatures are always finite in our entrance into divine life. That's, I'm kind of wandering through a lot of different topics here, but I think of death and the fall as a limit that's placed on our capacity to reject God, to flee from God, that is above and beyond our creaturely finitude, the limits that come with being creatures. There's a sort of an additional limit. In that sense, it's also a good thing. It's also a gift, because it actually constrains our capacity to hurt each other and hurt ourselves. Nonetheless, there's some aspect of death which is not a gift of God, and which simply needs to be overcome, by the victory of God, as we're all ultimately invited into spiritual embodiment and divine life together. So, talking about the fall, it's not something that happened in the past. It's not something that there was this, and then there was the fall. It is whether, Justin and I've gone back, as he mentioned, back and forth of kind of even the terminology. Atemporal would imply that it's entirely outside of time. And sometimes it gets talked about that way, this kind of idea of the fall. But I prefer meta-historical because it's, I believe there are multiple creaturely kinds of time. And some of the kinds of time are not fallen. And our form of time that we currently occupy is actually, and David Bentley Hart uses this phrase multiple times in The Doors of the Sea, among other places. He uses the phrase fallen time, which the more I thought about just that phrase, the more I was like, that's unbelievable. I mean, it was just sort of boggled my mind that time itself could somehow be fallen and flattened, collapsed, incomplete in its connectedness. This is a way I really like to talk about it, and I really like some of what Justin's written in response, because he doesn't really buy some of the ways I try to articulate it, and then he articulates it in another way, and then I'm like, oh, that's kind of helpful. So it's actually been a kind of neat back and forth, because talking about a kind of time that we don't really fully experience right now is obviously a bit of a fool's errand. How do you talk about something you don't really have complete access to? But anyway, that's the claim, as I would put it, is that the human fall is something that is ongoing and currently happening within our fallen time. We're all participating in it. We're all falling. And from the perspective of some higher, more complete form of time, not prior to, but outside of time as we know it, it is a reduction. And it's a reduction that comes with fleshly mortality, suffering, death, the second law of thermodynamics, the ever expanding and either, heating up or freezing universe, whichever way it might be cosmologically. But that's all not what God intends. So anyway, long rambling answer.
No, it's a good starting place. There is no perfect starting place with this, because it's like there's so many facets to it. So you just gotta kind of ramble through it until you've got enough of it said that you can start to piece it. One thing I did in my last essay, which maybe I'll just recap quickly, is I presented Eugena's views on it, which I feel a little more confident in doing, if I can say that, than presenting my own ideas, because I love Eugena, and he's way smarter, or was, or however you want to look at it. Speaking of time, I'm going to go with his. He is way smarter than I am. And so I have a great respect for everything he says, and his theology forms the foundation of all of mine. And so I take this idea really seriously for that reason. But at the same time, I feel like I have a lot of questions where I'm like, I don't know how that's going to make sense. So in a nutshell, taking Eugena's 1,000-page dense volume of metaphysics and narrowing it down into a few sentences, the idea of the atemporal fall, which is probably the language Eugena would prefer, though I don't know that he uses that term specifically, is based on the idea, I guess the best place to start is the idea that all of creation exists eternally in the mind of God. And the metaphor that he uses for sort of understanding the relationship between the eternal creation in the mind of God and the temporal creation as we experience it, is writing on a piece of paper. And so he says, you've got thoughts in your mind, and you write them down on the page. And your mind is the mind of God in this metaphor, and your page is all of history. The pages of history, the temporality of the world. And you write down your ideas, and they become solid and fixed on the page in a sequence, and sort of unchanging in a way. They're sort of like they become a thing. But in your mind, they're a little more fluidic, a little more amorphous. And when they go onto the page, they don't leave your mind. That's the key part. Like your thoughts stay within your mind, and that's still primarily where they exist. And what's on the page is a representation of what still exists in your mind. And so that's, I find a helpful metaphor, even though it's still difficult to wrap your head around. So the idea being that everything that we experience in time is a a reflection, a symbol, you might even say, of eternal truths, of eternal realities. And that's a very Platonic idea. It goes back, and Aristotle didn't, invent that whole cloth or anything. And so with that said, the idea then is that Eden exists, or Eden is a symbol of the creation, the eternal creation. It's probably better to say that Eden is a symbol of the eternal creation, so that we can speak about events that happen in the eternal creation, and happen is a hard word to use outside of time. But we fall into these things. We'll say before, and then we'll put it in quotes, or at the moment, and put it in quotes. And so this Eden, which is human nature, which is all of creation. So Eugene also thinks that the human nature is the totality of all creation, which is something we could dive into more if we wanted to. And so when Eden fell, when Adam and Eve fell from Eden, all of creation fell along with it. And they fell into time, out of eternity into time. And their time is therefore a consequence of the fall. It's not a punishment from God, but it is a consequence of the fall. And all of our experience of time is this sort of this illusion, a disordered illusion. And that the spiritual journey and the final work of Christ ultimately is to restore the temporal fallen creation to its original condition as the eternal creation in the mind of God. And so that's a lot to think about. And there's parts of it that really make a lot of sense to me. The idea that creation is a reflection of eternity makes a lot of sense to me. I feel pretty good about that. The idea of falling into time, I get a little confused about what that means, and especially the restoration of time. I get really confused about what that would mean. And Aristotle has this distinction between eternity and time. So Jesse was just talking about layers of time, levels of time, or kinds of time, whatever language you want to use for it. Aristotle has more of this sort of just there's eternity and there's time. And when I was first reading Aristotle, I had actually sort of done a deep dive into modern theories of time. I'm not a scientist nor a mathematician, so I have no claim to understand anything Einstein said. But I've listened to some talks of people who think they know what Einstein said. And it seems like relativity sort of suggests that time, the present moment anyway, is some kind of illusion, and that the past, the present, or there is no present, the past, the future, all exist simultaneously, and it's really just what they call a block of time, this block theory, and that our perception of where the present moment is subjective and illusory, and that the past and the future exist just as much as the present moment does. And that really fits with what Aristotle is describing, I think, as the eternal creation. That it's outside of time. It's all created in instance. And he says that at the moment that the Son is generated from the Father, all of creation comes into being within the Son at that moment, with the fullness of everything. There's nothing that is left undone. And then some people criticize this both in theology and in philosophy and physics as saying that it takes away free will. If the future already exists, then how could we have free will? And it's just this sort of flat predestination as a criticism that it gets. But I think that's missing kind of the whole point of it, which is that the present moment is an illusion. And so the idea that like I'm choosing what's going to happen in the future is also an illusion, because I exist in the future and I exist in the past. And there's no reason to privilege the present moment. So in my mind, I don't know, I'm just rambling now, but in my mind, it doesn't actually take away free will at all, because I'm in the future making decisions. It's not, I don't only exist here. I exist in all of those places. And I just perceive right now this place. So I don't know if any of that made any sense or was helpful at all.
Does Eugene use the phrase restoration of time or restored time?
I'm trying to think. He definitely talks about the restoration of all things as this sort of coming out of time and back into eternity. I'm not sure if he talks about the restoration of time specifically. I'd have to look for that.
Yeah, I mean, if he did, that would sort of imply some multiple qualities of time or something like that. Which would, move it in the direction that I tend to think in. I'm getting a lot of what I think of as far as qualities of time from most currently from Sergei Bulgakov, and also there's just a lot of pre-modern ideas about time, as like the Greeks had multiple, terms for time, and there was qualitative time and sequential time, is sometimes how it's what's that? Oh, I think I just heard my own echo. Sorry. Maybe another me from another time. But sometimes in contemplative traditions, there'll be, references to, from a variety of contemplative traditions, references to more transcendent form of time, or the sense that we can transcend the present moment, certainly, which I think the way you're talking, Justin, kind of gets me thinking about, I almost feel like when you're talking about the physics and relativity, it feels to me like talking about different types or qualities of time, because it's just experiential. We currently can't experience time in the way that the physicists that you're describing are telling us time actually exists. Like, we only experience it sequentially. Now, maybe with meditative practices or, mind-altering substances and things, we can get glimpses in various ways of how, and there are stories of saints and holy people who actually, transcend time, and interact across times. And you get that quite a few different religious traditions. But that to me feels very similar to what I'm sort of gesturing at when I say there's layers of time, or the way Bulgakov puts it, he says temporality is a creaturely reality. And even with, the Maximus, the confessor, says we become uncreated as we're divinized. Like, it's very extreme language. But even with that, I think Maximus, and certainly Bulgakov, is still maintaining that we operate within the abstract category of temporality, but temporality is experienced for us in concrete ways, based on the quality of our, capacity to see and interact with with, we could say, God's, eternal creation. So our capacity to interact and see others, and the fullness of all the particulars and all the fullness of God's eternal creation, of which we are a part. Our capacity there gives us experientially different types of time. So if it's true what the physicists are saying, if your summary of what the physicists are saying is accurate, accurately representing them, and then if the physicists are right, you've got a lot of territory potentially, if we could access it, for interacting with each other and with ourselves, right? And we talk about that even in our kind of flattened form of time. When you mentioned working with people and in your own, history, 12-step programs and stuff, like, we have to do work on ourselves, and we have to do, and we have to imagine if that could be done together with each other in some way that was real and wasn't simply limited to the present moment. So I tend to think that Jordan Daniel Wood talks about repentance, for example, as actually acting on the past. Like, it's actually doing something to the past. And David Bentley Hart has referenced this, I think, at most maybe dramatically, in a conversation with the British author lady that he likes so much, Sally Vickers, I think is her name. But he or she was telling a story in one of their two conversations together that they recorded, where someone had a very, very hard traumatic experience, and they were working through it with a therapist, and another person who was involved in the experience, independently, both of their memories of the experience, completely independent of each other, changed. And it's almost like, the experience itself altered in the past, independently for both of them. And whether there's that kind of, a dramatic claim that can be made, about anything in this life, repentance and prayer and our own work on ourselves, changes us in a holistic way that sort of brings the past along with it and redeems the past in some real way. So yeah, I'm rambling as well, but you can't really help but do anything but ramble on some of these topics. But that idea that Bulgakov, the way I really like Bulgakov's terminology of as creatures, we have to navigate via the abstract category of temporality, but we experience that concretely based on the quality of our spiritual perceptiveness, and we can then, he says that each different type of angel, traditionally in Christian, like medieval theology and stuff, each angel is a genus. It's not a species. Each angel is a genus, and humanity is a kind of multi-personed angelic genus. Incidentally, and you're Gina, you know all of that, but that Bulgakov says every angel experiences temporality in a different way. So there's as many kinds of time as there are kinds of angels, and I like that. Time is a concrete experience of each other and of God's reality. And we're capable of a lot of different types of concrete experience of God's creation and of each other. But anyway,
there's so much in all of that I want to jump on. But I think in the interest of not adding more ideas, I'd like to try to dig a little bit deeper into the ideas that y'all are mentioning. I'm going to read something, and I'm going to follow it up with a question. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was in the beginning with God. All things came into being through him, and without him not one thing came into being. What has come into being in him was life, and the life was the light of all people. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness did not overtake it. When we talk about a fall, particularly what seems like, and when we talk about time, but when we talk about what seems like a fall out of eternity and immateriality into time, perhaps in all of its gradations and qualities, but into time and into materiality, when we make the tumble out of God's mind through the pen into the words on the page, how is that fall different? Or would either of you say that it's different from the Word bringing things into being? Is the act of creation mentioned here in this hymn different from the fall? And I want to add that the reason I'm asking this question in part is because to me this seems like and this is not a systematic theological text. It's not attempting to explain something. It's attempting to point at something, and I get that. But it seems like it's saying that creation is a divine thing, that the coming into being of the things of the world is an act of God through the Word. And it would seem, I would assume, to be a good thing. At least it seems to be here. And yet it also seems like the things that we're talking about are the same thing, like that they're different ways of looking at the act of the Word bringing things into being, which to me raises questions about well, what is God's intent really? How are we supposed to separate the loving intent of creation from apparently sentient beings somehow making a choice that results in a world that is less than it should be? And particularly when we're talking about big things like time and materiality, infinitude, which would seem to be the thing that the Word is creating, in fact. How do these things fit together for y'all?
I'm sure Justin and I would answer that. Very good question, and very important question, differently. I'll take a quick shot at it. The fall and creation, Maximus says this, and Jordan Daniel Wood has a short little essay on it on the Eclectic Orthodoxy blog, and then about 25 pages on it in his book on Maximus, Creation as Incarnation. But Maximus says in 3 different places that God's creation and our fall are the same thing. They happen simultaneously and together. So God's creation is good, and it's happening now, and the fall is not good, and it's also happening now. And one comes from God and will always be flourishing and alive. The other is our contingent, contained a result of our incapacity, but a result of our false delusory kind of sense that we could do something apart from one another, that we could do something apart from God. And that's not actually so that desire on our part insofar is a desire to separate from each other, to separate from life itself. And even though it's always got at its heart, as a desire of ours, it's always got sort of at its very core a desire for life, a desire for each other, and a desire for God. Nonetheless, we have this illusion of a way to achieve that is actually a departing from one another and a departing from God to achieve that end. And it's often a self-aggrandizing way, etc. And that it's not actually the capacity to achieve what we want. It's an illusion that is an incapacity to achieve what we want. But grounded in all of that incapacity of ours and that delusion of ours, we are actually responsible for the fact that what the entire cosmos is experiencing is not simply God's creation, but is also something short of God's creation. And that's the absolutely crazy and astonishing claim in like as succinct way that I could put it. I think David Bentley Hart and several others make it very, very explicitly, and it's almost offensive. It's so crazy. Particularly the part that says our delusions, our attempts at, the way Jordan Daniel Wood puts it is our attempts at false incarnation, our attempts to make things that are going to serve this delusion, delusion that we have that we can somehow achieve life and flourishing via separation and dependence and whatever. That attempt at false incarnation, that we would have the capacity to cause the entire cosmos as we're perceiving it in empirical history to be experiencing suffering and death and incompleteness and awaiting. The language that Paul uses is that the cosmos is awaiting the revelation of the sons of God, the children of God, so that the entire cosmos is in some sense in a kind of birth pangs and awaiting, waiting for humanity to get its act together. And I think I would not use humanity there strictly in the sense of Homo sapiens on this planet. it's beyond that in ways that I couldn't pretend to articulate. But I do think I think it just the claim itself suggests that humanity is something that's wrapped up with all of creation. The term that David Bentley Hart loves to use is it's a Greek. None of us know Greek, and we keep bringing up Greek terms, but there you go. Metanoia, I think. No, that's it's the Greek term for a hinge. A point where things come together and connect and move together, like a hinge point. And the idea that it's often related to our priestly vocation. But just the claim itself suggests that all of creation is in some sense, well, we're dependent on creation. We need to learn from it, and we're dependent on it, but it also is in some sense dependent on us. And there's this kind of mutual relationship, and that us there might or might not include, angelic life, fairies, gods, goddesses, animals, in a whole host of ways that I'm not drawing any boundaries there myself, and I don't think David Bentley Hart would, although Bulgakov does draw some firmer lines in some of this. But anyway, wow, I've really rambled off the topic, but that was my attempt to answer your very good question.
That was
no, I think,
if I might, and I do want to give Justin a chance to answer. I want to ask one clarifying question though. So on that account, would you say that like God's intent in the creative act is not a world with, aging, sickness, and death, as the Buddhists describe?
Yeah, definitely. I think that's really at very close to the heart of, like The Doors of the Sea by David Bentley Hart. And he and others have said this. I mean, he's not, I think Gina would agree, there's a lot of Christian and not just Christian, a lot of contemplative spiritual leaders, teachers would agree that God's intent is not suffering and death in this kind of way that separates us, damages us, allows us to damage each other, damage ourselves, all of that. That's not God's intent. It's not God's will, and it's not God's creation. That is the result of creatures being free. In fact, it's not just that we're free. We have to participate in creation in order for creation to be. That's the point. Like, unless we participate in creation by our own free and creative actions, we have to look for it, find it, and do it, or it isn't it isn't incarnated. It doesn't God's creation depends on us in a very real sense, our response. And it's a lack of it's a broken and incomplete, childish, Irenaeus, I think, uses that, at its inception, our response is, and all creatures are going to respond initially with a degree of incompetence, naivete, innocence that's kind of childish innocence. We're going to stumble and fail. But the claim that I'm making, and I think I'd be representing, some much more qualified folks than myself, is that not all creatures, so all creatures respond with some degree of ignorance and, mistakes as we begin receiving the invitation to participate in God's infinite creative life. But some creatures together in a collective body, and this gets back to, I think, Justin, you referenced, humanity is one body in a way that's I'd reference, like we're an angelic genus, multi-personed angelic genus. But that idea that we in particular have not just responded in a simple kind of ignorance, but have made an effort to do it in a destructive way, to receive God's creative life in a particularly hurtful and selfish and destructive way, it goes above and beyond, creaturely bumbling. That's universal. I would say all the angels have bumbled at some point. Like, it's just a part of becoming a god or a goddess. Like, it's a part of becoming divine. As creatures, we're going to bumble a little, but we've done something a little beyond, stumbling around or a kind of childish mistake, and it's horrific, and it's not God's will.
So on this kind of account as you're articulating it, both natural and moral evils, to use some sort of generally agreed upon terms, are in fact evil, not just undesirable and unpleasant.
Yeah.
They are not
Therefore,
not God.
Not God's will, utterly irrational. Now, God makes them productive in a certain way. So I wouldn't say, and Justin and I think went back and forth on this a little in some of our writings, and he was pushing back on, death becomes, productive. Even evil, in a sense, is productive. I would agree there. God makes all things productive, but it's not a part of His will in my view.
So, and thank you. I appreciate you letting me tease that out, because I think it's one of the points of really stark divergence between you and Justin as I am understanding things. But I want to let Justin.
I think so. But let's let Justin talk.
Yeah. No, it is one of the points of divergence, and it's an important question. And it's one of, to be fair, I think Jesse's represented Eriugena pretty well as well. I don't know about the exact details of everything would be exactly the way Eriugena, but the thrust of what Jesse just described is also what Eriugena describes. And that makes sense because Jesse is referencing Maximus, and Eriugena was heavily influenced by Maximus, and so there's a lineage there as well. So maybe I'll do the thing I did before where I'll say what Eriugena would say about it, and then I'll say where my questions come into it. So this is Eriugena, not Justin. So for the thrust of the question, and you asked, like, if God creates the world, then how can we say it's fallen? Basically, what does this mean? And it comes down to the question of death and suffering primarily. And so I think even in the Genesis text, you have this sort of flow, right? Where you have Genesis 1, where God creates everything, and it's good, and humans are very good even. And in Genesis 1, there's no sense of fall, right? There's this harmonic universe, a cosmos in the proper sense, where everything is the way God meant it to be, and it has a natural progression that flows, and when it culminates in more and more beauty in life. And that's Genesis 1, basically. But then you got Genesis 2, of course, right? Where then the fall happens, and what is all this? And I think, at the core of all that is this question of theodicy, of if God has created this good universe, then why is it so hard to live here? And I can relate to that on a personal level. I've struggled a lot in life. I've been homeless, an addict. I've slept on the streets. I've been beaten up and all kinds of things. And you're like, well, why on earth would God make this? Right? Like what? And so I can very much appreciate that question. It's an important question. And so for Eriugena, God created the world without death and suffering, and for many theologians. And the fall is the explanation of why the good God created this world, and yet we suffer within it. And so that's, I think, at the heart of why this question is important. And that relates also to time. And so for Eriugena, and I think it's a logical truth. Death only exists within time, at least sequential time, as we understand it, the basic experience of human time, regardless of what the angels might be doing. Over time, we die. And it happens over time, and it happens in the progression of events. And as we age, you can think about all of that. So time and death are related. And so the fall into time is a fall into death. And that is not God's will for us. So that's Eriugena's kind of position of why we need sort of these both things. And he would say that God created the world good through the word, in the word, as we referenced in Genesis 1 and John 1, which of course is harking back to Genesis 1. Those two texts are connected. And he would say that all of it was created good. within Christ, including the free will of the creatures, and that is itself a goodness. Free will is a goodness, and that when at the moment of creation, and this is a Maximus thing too, and this is part of where it starts to mess your brain up, right? Because when we're thinking about things before time, before fall and sequential time at least, that doesn't have much meaning, because we're talking about things that happen before sequence exists, and before is a sequential term. And so our minds start to like fart, as we're trying to think about that. But Eriugena says that there is sequence in eternity. The Father produces the Son, it generates the Son, and there's a kind of sequence. There's a one and then the other, but it doesn't happen temporally. There's no before the Son. There's no anything like that. And in the same way, I think Eriugena would probably say that creation was created good, it fell, and it landed in time, and all of that happened instantaneously, because there is no before and after before the before the fall. And so that all of it was created good in Christ, and all of it fell at the moment of its creation, because everything happened all at the same moment. All of creation was happening at the same moment, and we have to use quotation marks for all these words. With the English language doesn't help us talk about atemporal things. So I'm rambling now too. What's that say?
We'll just all have to learn Greek so that we can.
I don't know if the Greeks could do it any better. I'm not sure.
Maybe.
So the idea of the universal creature, which Jesse had mentioned, that's the Eriugena's language, the universal creature, is this entirety of creation that came into being in Christ eternally before fall and this before time and everything. And that is Adam, and that is humanity as a whole. And also creation as a whole, because human beings are the universal workshop, the universal creature, as an image of Christ who contains both heaven and earth, which we read in Colossians or something like that. I have the quote here, actually, I'll read it. So, and I don't have the reference for it. Colossians, yeah. So in Colossians, Paul says, referring to Christ, he is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn of all creation. For in him all things in heaven and on earth were created, things visible and invisible, whether thrones or dominions or rulers or powers, and all those things mean angels. All things have been created through him and for him. He himself is before all things, and in him all things hold together. And so us, as the image of Christ, who is the image of God, we're an image of an image, in a sense, and that's an idea I've been playing with, not a phrase that Eriugena uses. But we also contain, and Eriugena definitely says, we also contain the fullness of heaven and earth, all the angelic realities, all of the temporal, physical realities, all exist within the human spirit. And so when Adam disobeyed and decided to rebel and choose a path of death instead of life that was laid out for him in Eden, it was actually the collective choice of all of creation together making that choice and falling away into time. And for Eriugena, when Christ incarnates, he takes the entirety of creation into himself by taking human form. And that's specifically why he takes human form, because the human being is the microcosm of everything. And then when he resurrects from the grave, he resurrects the whole of creation, heaven and earth and everything. Contained within the microcosm, and then there's this sort of that applies to the bigger world and saves everything. So anyway, that's Eriugena. I hope that was coherent in some way. The questions that I have about it are largely about the nature of time. I mean, if we assume this sort of block time, eternalist time, which Eriugena seems to as well. And Jesse, you mentioned this, and I'd love to hear at some point what Jordan Wood thinks about it. I've listened to a couple of talks, but this idea of changing the past, I think that's really where the crux of it comes in for me. Because the idea of how Adam's fall affects the whole of the timeline is that it happens in eternity, and creation is a reflection of eternity, and therefore the whole of history is impacted by Adam's fall. And in Ariugena's reckoning, therefore, the whole of history is redeemed in Christ's resurrection. But then, if that's true, that means that from the Big Bang, everything is already fixed. And so this world of death and suffering is already saved because eternity, eternal salvation affects every moment in the same way that eternal fall affects every moment. And so it no longer serves as a theodicy in that sense. It no longer explains death and suffering because this is the redeemed world. This is the world that Christ redeemed. This is not the fallen world waiting redemption because in eternity, everything gets reflected back. It happens in the past just like it does now. So it starts to fall apart there for me. I don't understand even just internally how that's supposed to make sense. And then I also think that there's something beautiful about the give and take. I mean, if this is the redeemed world, and and we say God uses death for our good, it seems to me that death and suffering are actually catalysts in a sense, perhaps more accurately than mistakes. That they're there to be overcome, but they're not blunders. They're not something contrary to what God created. Because I don't know how that could be possible. That's another sort of logical thing I don't get. Like if God created us with free will and gave us the chance to choose good and evil, then God created that potential knowing, like, did God not know that we were going to fall when he gave us those options? Like, does this really take the blame off of God's shoulders for death and suffering? I don't know if any of that made any sense, but do with it as you will.
No, I mean, it makes a great deal of sense. I know we're nearing the end of our time, but if we're all right, I'll respond very briefly, and you guys can wrap it up.
Yeah, I've got lots of time, so I don't know if you have anywhere to be, but we can chat as long as you're
okay. Great. Yeah, no, I'm good to go a little longer. The two things come to mind. One is I don't think this is a theodicy, and you used the phrase not. I mean, you weren't being rude with it, but the fall explains evil or suffering. I mean that phrase explains something. It's like it's got a function, or it's being used, it's being sort of constructed, fabricated to patch something up or whatever. I don't think evil and suffering are sort of explicable. In a sense, I don't think God can be sort of gotten off the hook. Like the way that evil and suffering are simply bad and irrational and unintended by God. And that's not a simple answer. Like that's how can something be unintended by God? You're just left with a puzzle, and it does raise a lot of questions about human freedom, but it kind of also gives us a radical freedom and a radical responsibility. Like, okay, we have the capacity to do things that God didn't intend, but it's horrible. But so anyway, I would push back a little there, and I think there's something that could be kind of teased out to say let's not make too much of a systematic claim or a kind of case out of it, and so that's one line of kind of conversation I'd be inclined to raise. But the other one, which is kind of a whole different topic, is just coming at you had mentioned, I can't remember the phrase you used, but sort of there's a kind of beauty to, the give and take, I think was how you put it, which, I can easily relate to and agree with at a certain level, but, and this will become kind of like a cheap rhetorical, trick on my side where like, you bring up all the worst case scenarios and kind of dump them on the table. But but I mean, at the end of the day, that and then this begins to push my case back into the like, okay, so you are doing theodicy, because now I'm raising, the question of the innocent child that suffers intense pain, or abuse by powerful people who just use them, and then and then die with no reconciliation. How is that possibly sort of a part of a beautiful give and take? Now you did use the language of overcome. That's something that needs to be, God needs to be, there needs to be a victory and an overcoming, and a redemption there. But at the end of the day, then isn't God's intention revealed in that victory and not in the suffering of the child? Not in the agony that the child goes through. Which one reveals God's intention? The victory and the overcoming of it, or the actual, agony of the child? And so I'm kind of saying two different things, and they're not harmonized. I don't think I think I'm talking out of both sides of my mouth to some degree, and wanting to have my cake and eat it too, kind of rhetorically, where I say, well, it's not a theodicy, and let's not make it into a case. It's a statement, a sort of observation about how capable we are of brutalizing each other. And if you accept that, we are in some sense gods and goddesses, and there are also other, gods and goddesses out there, some of whom are, very good, and some of whom are as messed up as we are, then you begin to get a picture of this is an observation regarding what creating free and I think David Bentley Hart uses the phrase free and rational spirits, but creating gods by grace. Who is that? I'm quoting somebody there. I can't remember who, but anyway, that's a more kind of traditional Christian way of putting, what it is that God's creating, but creating these divinized beings that are going to share in divine life together isn't a kind of safe thing, even for God. And it comes with the potential for contingently, in a contained way, terrible things that God doesn't want. But anyway, I'm repeating myself grotesquely at this point. So
Yeah, no, that's fair. I'd be curious. I mean, the theodicy question we're just not going to answer. No one's ever done it. I'd be curious what you would think about the other point that I had made of saying that if salvation is eternal, then this cosmos is not fallen, because salvation is present, like it's saved before it exists.
Yeah.
So to speak.
Yeah.
What would you think of that line of thinking?
Yeah, I mean, I don't actually distinguish between God's creation and salvation per se. So I think that salvation is, before we fall, in this and after we fall, but I think of salvation as it's grace all the way down, in the sense that, like, we come from the life of God and we are returning. And I think that's continual, even outside of fallen time. I think that being creaturely is realizing both our source and our end in an ever expanding sort of realization. But yeah, so I don't ultimately think of salvation like, even had the world, because I actually think this gets extremely speculative, but that there could have not been a human fall. In a sense, from the perspective of eternity, and life with God, I don't think there will have been a human fall. And this gets into I've written an essay called Undoing the Crucifixion. I think that was the title I gave it. But and Jordan pushes this envelope really, really hard, talking about how the wounds of Christ are our current sufferings. And when our sufferings are done, Christ's body is no longer wounded. And that, and I'm just associatively bouncing around at this point. You raised a point, about Adam and Christ. I only read this the other day in Jordan's book. I'd read it once, but I had missed it. But he points out, I'm sorry, this isn't Jordan's book. This is John Bayer's book, his translation of Gregory of Nyssa's On the Making of the Human. It's actually On the Making of Man is the traditional title for the text by Gregory of Nyssa, and John Baer gives it. He says that title's always been wrong for thousands of years. The title that it should have, according to Gregory of Nyssa, is On the Making of the Image of God. But anyway, he has a new translation of it with Oxford University Press. And in talking about that, talking about the fall in his sort of intro to that translation, he says Origen believed that Paul believed that Adam was Christ. And that I had never picked up on that before, but that kind of we're the body of Christ is both kind of where our origin and our end. So of course Adam is Christ. Adam in his fallenness is us in our suffering and our damaging of each other now. But Adam in his creation in Genesis, in the Genesis 1 story, as you say, doesn't reference a fall, and that's Christ, beginning and end, Alpha and Omega. But so salvation, I would start sounding a lot like I did when I talked about death, I think, where like there's a sense in which salvation is a reality, maybe even within the life of God, insofar as the persons of the Trinity are at some, like, they have to receive one another and make a space for one another and place one another above themselves in a way that brings in some of that kind of sequential language that you're talking about. Eriugena says even in the life of God, there's in some sense sequential experience, but it also brings in a very I suppose way too abstracted or hypothetical of a way, like the idea of salvation, where God is continually, within the Trinitarian life of God, saving himself, so at that point, I'm just not distinguishing between the life of God and creation and salvation. But in our experience now, salvation is something very particularly and urgently needed. I just don't think it's a need that's an eternal need. It's a reflection of an eternal need, but it's a very contingent, although, horribly real need in our day-to-day fallen lives. It only reflects a salvation that salvation as we'll know it eternally, I think. Salvation as we know it eternally won't have all the urgency, that it does right now for us. This kind of desperate and tragic urgency. One day there won't need to be a victory. There won't need to be an overcoming that we need now. So anyway.
Yeah. Oh, were you gonna say something, Don? Please go ahead.
Well, I don't know, something that keeps bubbling up for me, and I don't know if it's different really from what you guys are saying, but it feels a little different. And maybe it's the East Asian influence in my thinking, but described so succinctly as samsara is nirvana, right? This idea that that awakening is to be found in suffering, that in some sense our relationship to what's happening is the difference. And I don't want to try to be syncretic or any syncretistic, whatever that word is. I'm not trying to combine things or say that they're the same, but just as a concise way of exploring the idea that like there's a big part of me that feels like the suffering is really important. And you know, as you were speaking, Jesse, I kept thinking, you know, you're talking about like at some point the crucifixion will go away. And I get it, and that's a really neat idea, actually. This, we can rewrite time through salvific acts and redemptive acts, is really lovely. But Christ's resurrected body in the Gospels still has his woundedness. And there's a sense to me in which that is profoundly significant, because it feels like it doesn't feel like Christ ascends from his woundedness. I mean, he ascends from the act of crucifixion, right? He gets resurrected from death, but it doesn't leave him. It's like he transcends and includes, to use Ken Wilber's language. There's a sense in which salvation, at least to the degree that it's expressed through the gospel story of what happens with Christ around crucifixion and resurrection, there's a sense in which something gets added to him through the suffering and integrated, which is what allows him to do this terribly important, this cosmically important and personally important thing. And I myself struggle with the idea that what will happen, that my salvation will be the removal of all of the things that I've been through and the ways in which they connect me to the people that I've been connected to. You know, not to neurotically hold on to my pain and suffering. I am a little like Captain Kirk in that way. Someone once pointed out to me that whichever Star Trek movie it was with Spock's brother, and you know, he comes in and he's trying to save everyone from their pain, and Kirk is like, "I am my pain. I need my pain." There is a little of that, but there is a sense in which like you can't separate me from my brokenness. My brokenness broke me open to be able to experience connection with others and genuine compassion and love and goodwill. And to the degree that I'm a better person than I used to be in time, much of that comes from transformation through suffering. And it feels like my wholeness, or the act of making me whole, shouldn't be an erasure of that. You know, that it should somehow honor and the word that comes to mind is it must love that somehow, in a way that redeems it. So I don't know how that fits in for you guys, but
I love it. I mean, I especially love your use of the image of Christ's wounds remaining after the resurrection. I mean, I'm going to write something about that. Thank you for saying that. It makes me think of the Felix Culpa, the blessed fall. You know, the idea that the crucifixion is what leads to resurrection, and that death is what leads to life. And sometimes I think that a lot of the patristic theologians, you know, the Ariugena, for instance, would emphasize the presence of death in the multiplicity of time as we experience it, that time is what leads to death. But I think it's also true and really important to point out that time is what allows birth, right? Because without, you know, time allows both, and they come into being together, at least as we experience it now. Maybe that's not true in the unfallen creation, I'm not sure. But they come into being together, and the fact that we die is what allows for birth, right? If all living beings never died and yet we still had birth, then we'd all just like crowd upon each other, and we would live this horrific life where we're a bunch of bodies piled on top of each other, not moving or whatever. And so they're built into the fabric of reality. And so maybe I'll say this is my alternative to the fall, the atemporal fall, which is something that I've taught and written about, and I feel a little more confident about, though I'm still not confident about anything of this, is the idea that rather than an atemporal fall and resurrection, what I would talk about is the eternal death and resurrection of Christ. And so I think of the life of Jesus as again, that reflection of what's eternal, that writing on the page. And so the life of Jesus is the page, is the reality of Christ, the eternal Son of God, written on the pages of history, as a symbol, not a symbol like it's a metaphor, but as a symbol, as something that points to a higher reality. So not denying the historicity of Christ. But that the incarnation, for instance, is a symbol of creation. The transfiguration is a symbol of deification. The death is a symbol of the fact that there is entropy in the world, and resurrection is a symbol of the fact that that entropy leads to new life. And that all of this is the nature of Christ, and therefore the nature of reality. And so it's awful, but it's also beautiful because it brings death and it brings birth, and it allows there to be change and motion. And so I think of time as a gift, rather than a curse. I think of it as the presence of the Holy Spirit, the movement within reality. And one of the I'd love to talk to someone who knows Ariugena better than I do, because he talks about the Holy Spirit as the motion of the universe, from what I understand to be in the Platonic sort of standard. That the logos is the pattern, the information, the knowledge, the ideas of everything that is the wisdom of all. And the spirit is the life that flows through it, animating it and bringing it to being and manifesting it and giving it life and presence. And that seems like a real gift. I mean, when you frame time that way, it's a beautiful thing. Part of the life of God, if it is the Holy Spirit that brings motion and life and movement, which are only possible within time, So I think of it as the fabric of reality has death and resurrection built into it, as this beautiful thing that allows something other than just a static eternal creation, but there's something beautiful about the unfolding of history, even though it's also ugly. So I'm not denying it's ugly. I don't know how that lands for you, but
the Jordan Daniel Wood points out that Christ's wounds are with him after the resurrection, but that the ascension hasn't taken place yet. And he makes the claim that Christ is wounded. Christ is always wounded in this world, and that his wounds are literally our separation from each other, our incompleteness in the execution of charity and love, toward one another. So that's the wounds on the body of Christ. And that when we fully embrace one another, when we fully receive ourselves in each other, Christ's body is made whole and unwounded. And he distinguishes them between the resurrected Christ and the ascended Christ, as he talks about that. But I would emphasize that there's some major points of agreement. We've done a good job, I think, teasing out, some of the differences. But I completely agree that we need our suffering, and that our suffering is salvific. But I would just add that that is because of our collective, flight from God and from each other. So in our current condition, Christ has revealed to us that, the prayer at Gethsemane, could you take this from me? No. Okay, I'll take it out myself. So Christ takes his suffering up. He carries his cross literally, and he dies willingly. And we have to do the same thing. And that's how we're saved. And, and it's not just received. John Bear says, your death is the one thing that is most truly your own. And that's true. But our whole life is death in this world. Like our whole life is one, long, slow receiving of death. And that is our salvation. So there's a lot of agreement there. From a spiritual practice, standpoint, we're on the same page, I would say. But I do differ in sort of maintaining that the way in which we would have had to die had we not fallen, there would have still been a kind of death, but it would have been a death of, the death of kenotic sacrificial love, of, giving up of yourself to receive the other fully. And all of that will continue to be a part of the life of God, beyond time, and would have been sort of regardless of the fall or not, in my view. There is a kind of death there, but that death is given to us in this life as in a kind of brutal way, still, even though as a gift, even fallen time and even sort of mortal, death, or however you put it, is a gift, in my view. It's just a gift, a contingent gift in response to a contingent problem, which is our finite effort to create a false way to God. But the another point of agreement, well, I want to circle back on your story of taking Eurygena out into the wilderness. You were referencing because there was a storm, and it was very, it lined up with the case you're making for kind of, cosmology and theology of like, revelation through catastrophic, event, and kind of weathering the storm, and then your answer, Erigena and God answered your prayer through the storm. That is, of course, you were doing that because of your own journey, through Native American practices, spiritual practices. But the one of the ironic things is, of course, that is exactly how the the green martyrdom of the Celtic, spiritual, mothers and fathers, they would have recognized that immediately. I mean, it was just what they always did, and they would have been like, no, duh, like, and so this was a universal human experience. And I just love, man, there's so many different, I want to jump back. So there's like things about that I want to say, and I think it does reinforce an awful lot of what you're saying. But I also really would love to jump back and the Eastern, some of the Eastern traditions that you're referring to, Owen, and there'd be a lot to think about and unpack there. But you spoke so beautifully about suffering as something that you would not, it's opened you to other people and opened you to God and given you a sense of, compassion and a point of contact. So beautifully put. I feel like a complete dope to even, push back at all. But if I tried, I would say the relationships that it opened you up to, and the need to get over yourself, the need to let go of yourself, that certainly, we're in agreement, that never goes away. You know what I mean? Like, but some of the means by which you got to that point of brokenness, weren't God's will, in my view. So the fact that you got to a place of self-abandon, an ability to let go of yourself in its selfish sense, and recognize others, and recognize God. There is a kind of death and even a kind of suffering, I think, that's built into that never goes away. But we get to those places via such pathetic and sad routes sometimes in our in our lives. The way I become impatient with my children, and then I repent of it. And but man, it would be nice if I could get to the fruits of the repentance without without being a horrible dad, you know what I mean? So to my kids. So you know, that's how I would start trying to talk about it. But it spiritually, from a standpoint of spiritual practice, and you know, encouraging people in a world where suffering is just, you know, so widespread, God is doing things. God is accomplishing things through our sin, through our suffering, through our waywardness and idiocy. And that's something you know, that's something we agree on, certainly, regardless of the bigger framework, probably way beyond any of our pay grades anyway.
Yeah, I'm definitely not set on ever coming to a solid, bigger framework. That's something that will always be fluid for me. There's something you had just said at the end there about coming into ourselves through the growth of our suffering. And there's a line from, or maybe I'll just recite the whole poem. Can I recite you guys a poem? I like poetry. There's a French mystic named Madame Guyon, Madame Jeanette Guyon. And she wrote this little poem, which someone translated in English, and I don't think they even know who did it. It was long enough ago. But it's about suffering. And she says, "By sufferings only can we know the nature of the light we live. The temper of our souls they show, how true and pure the love we give. To leave my love in doubt would be no less disgrace than misery. And so I welcome then with heart sincere the cross my Savior bids me take. No load nor trial is severe that's borne or suffered for his sake. And thus my sorrow shall proclaim a love that is worthy of the name." And that's a poem that's really stuck with me. It's meant a lot to me. That's why I memorized it. And I think there's something to be said. You know, when I think about the metaphysics of it or the theology of it, I don't know if it's metaphysics or whatever. You know, there's this idea that in the suffering we grow and learn, and we overcome the suffering, and that's the thing that we talked about before. That's like, you know, I definitely don't think that God has allowed suffering or created suffering, however you want to frame it. I'm not sure what the difference between allowing and creating would be for that. Not for the sake of suffering itself, but for the sake of overcoming it. And I think sometimes we falsely equate perhaps suffering and evil. And I think Christ on the cross shows us that it was, you know, we call it Good Friday, right? But I'm not sure what was good about it. You know, and I think there's a certain extent, and maybe this is, you know, sort of Buddhist, or perhaps of the Desert Fathers and the, you know, the pursuit of apatheia, where we desire to, or God desires us to overcome our aversion to pain and suffering for the sake of something greater.
Mm-hmm.
And that in the spiritual life, we come to a place, and I'm approaching it, maybe perhaps, I hope, where not when I'm in the midst of my most worst pain, because then I'm not like this at all. But we come to a place where we see that our pain and suffering is, you know, just part of the unfolding of time, and there's something greater than that, and we sort of rise above it and encounter love while we suffer and see beauty while we suffer. And I think there's something about the cross in that's symbolically, the cross can be a million things, and symbolically, one of the things I think it is this message that though we suffer, though we die, even horrifically, as in the case of Jesus, of course, we can still rise above it in a way, and come to a place where we realize that it's just a contingent experience, and it's not actually the depth of what we are and who we are and the reality of our life in God. I don't know if that makes any sense.
No, it does, for sure. Yep.
And it brings to mind something that I thought of earlier, which is a symbolism, a way of thinking about the cross that I think I got from Houston Smith some 15 or 20 years ago. In the idea that the cross, you know, the horizontal plane of the cross symbolizes historical time, and it's or sequential time, the one moment after anotherness of our lived experience, which is it is a real thing. And even even when we talk about Far Eastern philosophies and spiritual traditions and so forth, when they say that creation is maya, this is all illusion. Well, they don't mean it doesn't matter, and they don't mean that it's a lie that we're believing. That maya is actually closer to magic.
Yeah.
It's to say that this is a phenomenal reality that emerges somehow from that which was not
Would
phenomenal.
potential be a good word for it? I mean, I love that.
Yeah, I think it would be, but I don't want to speak with any meaningful expertise. 'Cause I know people care a great deal about what these things mean, but to me, yes, creation is and I think it's consistent with the Sanatana Dharma to think of creation as the creative expression of the infinitude of God, and that is fundamentally a loving act. And to me, this is where why the theodicy question is less a question in the Sanatana Dharma is you don't get creation without finitude. Finitude is what restricts the one into the many by carving things away from one another. And we don't get left without right and up without down and in without out. And so we don't get good without evil. And we don't get life without death. And so these things are of a piece. And they don't all have to be expressed the way that they are. This is not to say that the universe is deterministic. I tend to take more of a multiversal sort of approach where God's infinitude is indeed expressed in its infinitude. It's just that we only get to taste it in our finitude. And we should not mistake the limitations of our experience of the cosmos as the entirety of the cosmos. And so there are worlds where children die horrible deaths and great pain, and it is an absolute poverty and tragedy. It's not to take away from that or to say that God wills that. It is to say that it's a part of God's infinitude, that the potential for that is within God, and we cannot express the doctor's compassion and healing work or the life-saving efforts of the medical staff or the deep and abiding love of the parents going through that experience in the absence of that child's suffering. For the fullness of each of those sentient beings to be expressed, we need a universe where all of those things happen. And so there is a universe where that child did not experience that. And, there's a universe where but indeed, although that's a great thing, there's also a poverty in it because the goodness expressed in all of its myriad forms of those involved in that sickness and death goes unexpressed. It's the book that isn't written, the painting that isn't painted, the song that isn't performed. In the absence of the death, you don't get the new life. And so sort of the way that I work it out is that God has created all of these things. God is creating God's infinitude, expressing God's infinitude broadly in ways that we don't see or contact. And so our questions are more about the limitations of our ability to experience the fullness of God in creation than they are real metaphysical questions. But I'm speaking for me, not the Sanatana Dharma, but I think it's an extension of that same idea. And just like, left and right and up and down and in and out and good and evil, there is God's will and not God's will. And in the tradition I will broadly refer to as Hinduism, there are dharmic acts, which are acts that are consistent with the will of God, which is a will of goodness, of bringing harmony and living authentically, and charity and mercy and love and protectiveness. And then there's adharma, which is that which is inconsistent with God's will, and we can, in that, although there is a non-duality of it all, the non-duality includes a duality, that you don't get them. It's not just the one, it's not just the two, it's all of it together is the fullness of the thing. And so the recognition that God is the infinite transcendent good is not inconsistent with the idea that, yes, but God means for very specific goods in this world. God prefers gentleness over harshness, and charity over judgment, and selfishness and peace over violence. And so we do get to pick, and our picking matters. And in our picking, we are divinizing. We are growing in God's likeness, because in some very real sense, by creating the many, God is limiting God's infinite will into a finite will to be expressed within the specific parameters of this creation. And we can choose that or not choose that in any given moment. And so we have all these events, on the horizontal plank of the cross, all these events in history and time. But then we have the vertical dimension as well, which is how deep do we want to go in it? Do we want to soar in the metaphysical heights of the moment? Do we want to get lost in the gross materiality of the specifics of the situation that are unfolding with no sense of the transcendent or the spiritual at all? Do we want to go deeply into the sensations of the moment, and I think touch eternity there too? But that's, to me, it feels like, although we started off with a theological discussion, we've come back to this spiritual practice discussion, because I do think that is what matters at the end of the day. I think humans engage in these questions not really, because I don't want to say because they don't matter in and of themselves, but I think we come to them out of our own existential insecurities and suffering. And we engage with them because we hurt, and life is hard, and we want healing, and we want to know how to do better. And we hate that we're impatient with our kids, and we don't want to be those dads anymore. God, I mean, when you said that, I was like, oh, that's me. Like, that's my suffering too. And all I want is to be a patient dad. And it's so hard. Why is it so hard? But there is a sense of like, it's hard because there are moments where I constrict myself to my smallest sense of who I am and how my needs can be met and what really matters. And I lose touch with the spirit moving through me, the spirit of patience and of gentleness, and what I need most of the time is to try to open up and relax and let that spirit flow through me. And that's spiritual practice stuff, and I don't know what God means atemporally or metahistorically for that, but it feels like a sacred moment, and a moment of real, genuine, divine intervention, frankly. That was always available to me, but I don't always open up to receive it.
Yeah.
I know that we have run long. I so appreciate both your time. I will actually sit here with you all morning. But if either of you would like to go ahead and go, we can certainly wrap things up here, or whatever.
Yeah, I had promised my family 10:30, so I should wrap up.
Yeah.
But it's been absolutely delightful, and I love where we ended up. Spiritual practices and overcoming suffering in our own lives and the lives of those we're, that we're sharing this journey with most immediately. It's a very good place.
Yeah, for sure. And I very much appreciate it. I'm glad that we finally got the chance. It's the first time we've ever chatted outside of text to, message and essays and emails and whatever. So it's just been also nice just to kind of sit with you, so to speak.
Yeah, absolutely, for sure. It's amazing what this pathetic little screen can accomplish. So
yeah, it's quite remarkable. It's sometimes I think, like if I could tell my ancestors even just a couple hundred years ago that I had a mirror in my pocket that let me speak to anyone in the world I wanted to, and pull up the knowledge of all the ancients in like a quick, just type in my question and up comes an answer. And they'd think I was a wizard. But yeah, we'll wrap up now. It's a good time, and tell your family that we're sorry for taking so much of your time, and thank them for their patience, their presumed patience. And much love and peace to you both.
Yeah, I hope we can do it again. It's great to meet both of you. Yeah.
Yeah.
Cheers.
Take care.